Hello, welcome to the first class. I'm going to record the first lectures and we'll also meet during the lecture hour that is scheduled. So the first class is going to discuss the concept of social structure um, from the Robert Burns textbook. And the textbook looks at key concepts in sociology. So Byrne discusses key sociological ideas in the context of Canada. And the book is really interesting because it offers you a whole series of examples regarding sociology, specifically Marxist concepts, and also concepts from key sociological thinkers like Emile Durkheim and Max Weber. But the book contextualizes this information um, by discussing Canada in detail. So Byrne discusses sociology in relation to society, and sociology is really the study of society. I have a PhD in sociology. My name is Tara at Lurie, and I will be your professor for the term. And I'll share different kinds of videos. This one is going to be focused on the PowerPoint, but I'll also have future recordings and lectures where I'll just discuss my own interpretation of the text. So, sociology is the study of society. So, before we begin, though, critical sociological theory, which is my background, would begin even before the study of society by asking what constitutes society. So, we are all in the online world together, and we could be anywhere. While we are part of this class together, and it is in Red Deer, Alberta, we don't have to be in Red Deer, Alberta. But even if we were in Red Deer, Alberta, we might be part of um, social movements or subcultures or rural communities that are really separate from each other. So, what constitutes society is really illusory and it changes. We might also feel as though we are part of society, and we might narrate our lives in relation to our citizenship or the ways that we feel that we belong to society. However, from a Marxist perspective, even if people feel as though they really belong to Canada, if someone is not a property owner, if they don't have regular employment, if they don't have a strong network of people, say, in their family whom they can inherit money from, then their belonging to society might be one that is symbolic or linguistic, but it might not mean that they have enough. It might mean that they don't have enough financial capital to really even participate in society fully. So, what Marxists would argue, and my background is in Marxist and neo Marxist theory, so conflict theories, which we'll discuss throughout the term, like feminist theory, critical race theory, queer theory, and um, Marxism. Disability studies is also another form of conflict theory. And so, what conflict theorists would argue is that we are given the promise of belonging to society. Um, when we say pay for certain things, when we renew our passport, when we renew our health card, when we participate in the union, when we pay taxes. And we pay for these things, but this does not necessarily mean that we are all equal participants in society. The law and the Canadian law, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms includes us all equally, but this does not mean that everyone upholds the law. And so the case that I will discuss in the first lecture is the murder of Cindy Gladue, who is a Cree woman who was found in an Edmonton motel room and she had bled to death. And I'll give a trigger warning. The descriptions might be somewhat graphic, but I will use language. I won't show graphic images. So a society then is a group of people who share a common culture, live in a defined community, and interact with each other. Societies are made up of people, institutions, shared beliefs, and cultural ideals. They also typically share a political authority. So here are some other characteristics of society. Abstract. Society is abstract and can't be seen or perceived through the senses. It involves both likeness and difference. Societies involve both likeness and difference, as people who are exactly alike would have limited relations. Main components. The three main components of society are shared norms, values, beliefs, and attitudes. Sociologists classify societies based on their level of technology, such as pre-industrial, industrial, and post-industrial. So again, my background is in Marxism, and if you're interested in Marxist sociology, York University in Toronto has a strong tradition of Marxism, and it is known to be a left-wing program, the sociology department at York University. That's how I would characterize my experience. And so what Marxists would say is that this idea that society is abstract and cannot be perceived through the senses is not necessarily true for all of us. That if you were part of, say, a community, an ethnic community, or a subculture, or a kind of what Jürgen Habermas would call a counterpublic, meaning a small kind of organization or group of people, then the senses might be important to you. So, for example, if you're part of the Indian diaspora or um, another diaspora, food might be really important to you, music, language that is not English or French. There are other kind of sensory experiences, however, of the state that might be really important to how you perceive society. A negative example is policing. That the experience of being policed, of being stopped and searched by police, of being harassed by police is a sensory experience. So the three main components of society are highly debatable. We might not share norms, values, beliefs, and attitudes because of our political beliefs. So Robert Byrne discusses the four levels of social structure. An important step in broadening your sociological awareness involves recognizing that four levels of social structure surround and permeate us. Think of these structures as concentric circles radiating out from you. Microstructures are patterns of intimate social relations formed during face-to-face interaction. Families and friendship cliques are examples of microstructures. Mesostructures are patterns of social relations and organizations that involve people who are often not intimately acquainted and who often do not interact face to face. Social organizations such as colleges and government bureaucracies are examples of mesostructures. Macrostructures are overarching patterns of social relations that lie above and beyond mesostructures. One such macrostructure is patriarchy, the system of power relations and customary practices that helps to ensure male dominance in economic, political, and other spheres of life. Global structures are the fourth level of society that surrounds and permeates us. Economic relations among countries and patterns of worldwide travel and communication are examples of global structures. So, we can again critique the four levels of social structure from the perspective of class antagonism. So, microstructures are patterns of intimate social relations formed during face to face interaction. Families and friendship cliques are examples of microstructures. So, if we were to think about the treatment of Indigenous peoples, do you have intimate social relations or face to face interactions with Indigenous people, particularly Indigenous women and girls? The mesostructures are patterns of social relations and organizations that involve people you're not intimately acquainted with, but colleagues in your workplace. Are Indigenous people people that you have come into contact with in organizations like schools, the healthcare system, in state organizations that we are all supposedly participate in? Thirdly, macrostructures are overarching patterns of social relations that lie above and beyond mesostructures. So one such macrostructure is patriarchy. Um, and when we discuss the murder of Cindy Gladue, we can ask how Indigenous women are treated and how they, and if they can survive really intense forms of settler patriarchy. Global structures are the fourth levels of society. So, what do Indigenous issues look like from the perspective of global structures? On the one hand, we could say there is a global movement of indigeneity, Indigenous rights in Australia, New Zealand, um, throughout the world. On the other hand, we could say that global structures and the global economy allows people to immigrate to Canada who can benefit from settler colonialism and who might not have any understanding of Indigenous peoples. So, as more and more people immigrate and invest financial capital in Canada, what effect will this have on the Indigenous peoples of Canada? On on a diverse group of Indigenous peoples in cities and in rural areas. So as the housing prices increase and there is more financial capital, say from India or China, what effect will this have on Indigenous peoples, and what effect will it have on the treatment of Indigenous people and how we think about indigeneity? So Byrne argues then that personal problems are connected to social structures at the micro, meso, macro, and global levels. Whether the personal problem involves finding a job, keeping a marriage intact, or acting justly to end world poverty, considering the influence of social structures on us broadens our understanding of the problems we face and suggests appropriate courses of action. So Byrne cites C. Wright Mills, and C. Wright Mills is a really well-known sociologist. C. Wright Mills wrote sociological texts and ideas many years ago, but Mills' ideas are still relevant because C. Wright Mills was interested in the ways that our personal problems are not just personal, they are also always structural and political and connected to the economy. So the example that Byrne gives in the textbook of, I should pronounce it's Robert Byrne. Let me check. I've read the textbook, but it's good to check. So the example that the author gives, so it's Robert Brim, sorry. So Robert Brim writes that uh, poverty in Canada cannot be thought of as an individual problem, and that unemployment and precarious housing and poverty is really a symptom of our economy. And so in the 1990s, I would add to Brim's understanding of the economy and shifts in the economy by also discussing neoliberalism. So Brim discusses changes in production and moves to automation and globalization, which have threatened Canadian industries. But I would also argue that the 1990s created a time of what authors have termed neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is a time of kind of new liberalism. So, neo meaning new, and liberalism meaning liberal beliefs. And Canada already had a very laissez-faire approach to capitalism, meaning that we have a free market economy. You are free to sell your labor, you are free to buy anything at all times. And this kind of new freedom is also about the cultivation of the self and self-branding using social media. It's about the kind of endless self uh, who is always working, and if one is not working, they're working on self improvement, they're constantly improving the self. The problem is that this kind of new liberalism or new freedom corresponds with the complete dissolution of the social welfare state. So, if we are free and we are newly free to brand ourselves, to sell ourselves, to work at all times, to work online, and then to have our own personal brand, to sell things on Instagram, we're constantly being given new forms of freedom to make money. Um, you can also work in different countries, and then you can transfer the money into your Canadian bank account using an online transfer. All of this is possible. But with freedom, there is a lack of perhaps security and protection. So, what we lose when we are free is security and protection. And the social welfare state might have guaranteed that in the past. So, the social welfare state model is an older model of state governance in which the state would have taken care of you. So if you were a citizen, you would be guaranteed things like free housing, free education, a job. However, you would not be allowed to kind of sell yourself outside of these systems. So the healthcare system is still an example of a social welfare state model that you can use all aspects of the Canadian healthcare system, but if you want to access other forms of healthcare, you would perhaps have to go to the United States of America. There is not that much private healthcare you could access. So that is an example of a social welfare state model. Um, the educational system is still an example. We have a Canadian educational system, so all of our colleges and universities, and especially our high schools and elementary schools, are all standardized. But over time, this could change. And the problem with neoliberalism is that it creates this kind of unregulated market. So in the same way that you don't have to just buy Canadian clothing, you could buy clothing from Zara or H&M, you could buy clothing from uh, Yves Saint Laurent, or like a French fashion designer, European clothing. You can also buy clothing from China or India online, and it will ship to you. We don't have a protected economy. Consumerism obviously allows us to buy lots of different food and order things from different countries, but education and healthcare still continue to be standardized. There are proponents of neoliberalism who would argue that it would be better if our institutions had to compete with private institutions, if we had to compete with American universities or American doctors, that this would make us more competitive. There are obviously people who are harshly critical of neoliberalism who will argue that the standard will decline if people can sell anything, and that fairness will also decline because people who have enough money will simply buy things rather than following our institutions and and we won't have a standardized form of healthcare education. People who are really wealthy can kind of use these other systems that are paid for. So standardization creates a sense of equality. So the case of Cindy Gladue is one of many really tragic cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada, which is also referred to as Turtle Island. Um, Cindy Gladue, 36, was a mother of 3 children. On June 22, 2011, she was found dead in an Edmonton hotel room. She had bled to death from an 11-centimeter wound to her vagina. On March 18, 2015, a jury found Bradley Barton not guilty of first-degree murder. In June 2017, the Alberta Court of Appeal has overturned Barton's acquittal and ordered a new trial. The appeal court decision said there were flaws in the ways the jury was instructed to consider sexual assault offenses and the laws relating to consent. Barton's lawyer appealed, saying the appeal court's ruling was flawed. In March 2018, it was announced that the Supreme Court will review the order for a new trial. So the trial happened, and Bradley Barton was convicted without appeal by the Supreme Court of Canada. So there are a lot of topical cases regarding Indigenous rights in the media. The Cindy Gladue case was an example of, firstly, systemic racism, and the courts consistently found that the media's treatment of the case involved derogatory images and narratives about Cindy Gladue. So Cindy Gladue was referred to as, quote, a native prostitute and, quote, a native girl over 50 times in court. Bradley Barton was not referred to as a man or as a white man or as a man with addiction and mental health issues or as a working class or poor man. He was just referred to as Bradley Barton. And so the naming of Cindy Gladue created a narrative that in many ways justified abuse or created categories. And when we create categories of persons using names, we often do so hierarchically. And the law, however, does not work through hierarchy. There's no hierarchy of rights in Canada. We all have the same rights. So these kind of uses of language were discussed in the media and the press and have been written about by academics. And in the Supreme Court decision, the kind of poor treatment of Gladue in the media was also discussed by lawyers and the judge who finally convicted Bradley Barton. So this photo was used over and over again in the Canadian press, and Catherine Morton discusses the ways that these kind of very unfeminine and kind of high-risk images of Indigenous women and girls are used even after they die. So the fact that she's smoking, and this is the photo that was used after she died, I think is really indicative of the use of images of Indigenous women and girls in really negative ways to support also eugenic fantasies of settler nation building. So health and class position are something that are often really labored over in settler Canada, and constructing Indigenous peoples as being poor or as being addicts is a way of excusing the violence that is done to Indigenous people. So, this kind of constant narrative that involves addiction is a way of avoiding responsibility. Um, these kind of images of women specifically are also about the law, that um, the kind of anxiety over images of women doing things alone or not with husbands and children is also about the law and legal reason. So Morton argues that the idea of ugliness is often grafted onto the bodies of Indigenous women and girls through highly charged imagery. Ugliness is deployed in order to bolster the us versus them, colonizer versus colonized, civilized versus savage binaries that are inherent to the ongoing colonial project. Naming missing and murdered women as ugly bodies makes it possible for these, quote, ugly victims to act as the perfect foil to civilized, innocent, and attractive white feminine colonial bodies. So this kind of construction of Canadian femininity is also not innocent, that in many cases of racism, as documented by Black feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw Williams, the creation of an extreme stereotype regarding one group of women supports another extreme, which is the extremely healthy, rich, white Canadian woman who's the perfect mother and wife. Like this kind of extreme image supports these derogatory images of Indigenous women. And what inevitably ends up happening when you create extreme images is that you justify then extreme treatment of people. So, in the same way that Cindy Gladew's life ended in the public sphere in a hotel room with Bradley Barton, and Gladue was accused or thought to be involved in high risk sex work. The other extreme is the kind of perfect wife or mother, and this kind of perfection is something that feminists have discussed in the 60s and 70s as being a perfection that often justifies spousal abuse and domestic violence. So family members of Cindy Gladue, a Métis and Cree mother who was killed in the hotel room, say the pain they continue to feel after her death is unspeakable. Cindy Gladue's mother, cousin, and sister told a sentencing hearing for Ontario truck driver Bradley Barton that they relive her violent death every day. I feel broken when I see my great-grandchildren with their mothers, without my daughter and without their grandmother, Donna McLeod said in a statement read in court Monday by a representative of the family. So for 10 years, this case was in the media, and it took 10 years to convict Bradley Barton. But he was convicted. So as I mentioned, during the trial, Cindy was referred to as a prostitute or sex worker over 50 times. And the images that were used were really derogatory and also demeaning. Morton discusses the ways that certain camera angles are often used when Indigenous women and girls go missing. So she talks about the use of mugshots after these people go missing. And the use of the mugshot, again, makes one think about victims who are depicted as criminals. And this often happens in many instances of gender-based violence like rape or sexual harassment. It is the woman who is often put on trial, and this is against the law. Throughout the whole history of rape law in Canada and America, lawyers, judges, medical doctors have argued against the vilification of victims and against any introduction of their sexual history into the court of law. I'll skip ahead in the interest of time. When I post the slides, you can look at the clips as well. Um, so the use of Gladys' actual body and vagina after death in the court case really shocked people. And this is one of the reasons that I think the case got so much attention. The obsession with kind of looking at her body is something that Shireen Razak argues is a form of excessive violence. So this kind of excessive violence involves a scopophilic gaze, and scopophilia means the obsessive desire to look. So the fact that the public kept having to look at Cindy Gladue and her body parts even after she died, and so did the court, is, I think, really, it's a really chilling example of discrimination. So finally, I'll finish by discussing Shireen Razak, and I will talk about Shireen Razak's writings regarding legal gray zones. So what Razak argues is that the law um, actually creates categories of persons who can be made to be missing, because when they go missing, um, there will be a legal gray zone where one does not really know how to stop the accused from appealing, as in the case of Barton, who appealed for 10 years. The indifference or this determined look away from colonialism is also what creates a legal gray zone. So if you fall into a legal gray zone, then you can be thought to be a disposable person, someone who can be killed at will, and someone who does not receive justice. The geography of these cases is also what explains this, that many cases of Indigenous women going missing or being murdered or being sexually harassed happen in very rural and remote parts of Canada. So as I have stated, Shireen Razak discusses the way that the law participates in gendered disposability through the creation of legal gray zones where sexualized violence is permitted. And Razak has written a book called Race, Space, and the Law. And in this text, Shireen Razak discusses the murder of Pamela George, which was one of many cases that happened years ago before Cindy Gladue's case, or before the murder of Cindy Gladue. So in the case of Pamela George, this legal gray zone was not only linguistic and symbolic, it was also spatial. And what Razak argues is that the men who killed Pamela George were actually these very upstanding suburban fathers who lived in the suburbs, who went to their office jobs, were these very straight-laced middle-class men. However, when they wanted to kind of let loose and act in violent ways or engage in addictive behaviors, they went to Indigenous territory. And they then assaulted women like Pamela George, who did also die. So creating a legal gray zone is also about knowing where and when it matters to follow the law. And there are obviously other examples. If you live in a certain neighborhood, you are probably aware that it is a certain kind of neighborhood, and you might see people throwing garbage. You might see them acting in certain ways that don't necessarily correspond with the law, and this might be because of class position. So the naming of Cindy Gladue was also about a legal gray zone. So if you call someone a name, does this mean that they no longer have legal rights? Of course, they still have legal rights, but is the name supposed to tell one about a person who is constructed outside of society and therefore does not have any legal rights? So in order to get at the specific persistent, and excessive sexualized violence directed at Indigenous women and the widespread ignoring or minimizing of this violence. We will need to find ways to name the deeply embedded and systematized devaluing of Indigenous life in settler societies and the specific sexual brutalization of Indigenous women that runs through them, tracking the ways in which this brutalization and attempted annihilation is sustained through state practices and through law in particular. So the case of Cindy Gladue is an example of the ways that social structures might delimit the possibilities that Indigenous women have in Canada. And it is one example of the ways that our society is deeply divided along certain class lines, and also the ways that we remain deeply divided regarding the rights of women and the actualization of gender justice. So I will finish with this quote by Audre Lorde: "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." So that is the first lecture. Thank you very much, and I hope you're doing well.